Wife discovers shocking secret about her husband. After years of marriage, her reaction changes everything. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. Emily Thompson first met John Miller on a crisp autumn day at Columbia University. The campus was alive with vibrant reds and golds as leaves fell gently to the ground. Emily, an aspiring artist with a sketchbook always in hand, was sitting under a large oak tree, capturing the scene with swift strokes of her pencil. John, a mechanical engineering student, was tossing a frisbee with friends when the disc veered off course and landed near Emily. "Sorry about that," he called out, jogging over. She looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "No worries," she replied with a friendly smile. "Just adds more movement to my drawing." He glanced at her sketch. "That's incredible. You made us look way cooler than we are." She laughed softly. "Maybe you're cooler than you think." From that moment, a connection sparked between them. They began spending time together, grabbing coffee between classes, exploring the city's art galleries, and attending concerts in Central Park. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, ranging from favorite books to dreams for the future. One evening, after watching an indie film at a small theater, they walked along the Hudson River. The city lights reflected off the water, creating a shimmering backdrop. "I've never felt this comfortable with someone so quickly," John admitted, his hands tucked nervously into his jacket pockets. Emily glanced at him, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. "Me neither. It's like we've known each other for years." He paused, turning to face her. "Maybe we're just two pieces of the same puzzle." She smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "I like that idea." After graduating, they decided to leave the bustling city behind and move to a quieter place. They chose a charming town in Vermont, known for its tight-knit community and picturesque landscapes. They found a cozy cottage with a white picket fence, surrounded by maple trees that blazed with color every fall. "This is it," Emily said breathlessly when they first stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue over the hardwood floors. "Our own little haven," John wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Home sweet home." Emily opened an art studio in town, where she taught classes and showcased her work. Her paintings, inspired by the natural beauty around them, quickly gained recognition. John joined a local engineering firm, where he worked on sustainable energy projects, something he was deeply passionate about. Their days were filled with simple joys. In the mornings, they sat on the porch sipping coffee, listening to birds sing. Weekends were spent hiking through forests, kayaking on the lake, or hosting dinner parties for friends. They cooked together, danced in the kitchen to old jazz records, and read books by the fireplace on snowy evenings. One sunny afternoon, Emily was planting tulip bulbs in the garden when John approached with a mischievous grin. "Close your eyes," he instructed. She raised an eyebrow but complied. She heard the rustling of a bag and felt something soft placed in her hands. "Okay, open them." She looked down to see a small puppy gazing up at her with big brown eyes. "Oh my goodness, John," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "He's adorable." "I thought it was time we expanded our little family," he said, laughing as the puppy licked Emily's cheek. They named him Baxter, and he quickly became a beloved part of their lives. Evening walks now included the energetic pup bounding ahead, chasing butterflies and sniffing every flower. On their 4th anniversary, John recreated their first date. He set up a picnic by the river, complete with candles, a basket of Emily's favorite foods, and a playlist of songs they loved. As the sun set, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, they reminisced about their journey together. "Remember when we got lost trying to find that art supply store?" Emily laughed. John chuckled. "We ended up discovering that amazing little cafe instead. Best apple pie I've ever had." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Every twist and turn led us here. I wouldn't change a thing." He kissed the top of her head gently. "Neither would I." Their love seemed unshakable. Emily cherished the small gestures, how John warmed up her car on cold mornings, the notes he left in her sketchbook, the way he always knew when she needed a quiet moment or a reassuring hug. One night, as they lay beneath a blanket of stars in their backyard, Emily whispered, "Do you think life can really be this perfect?" John squeezed her hand. "I think when two people are meant to be, they create their own perfection." She turned to face him, moonlight illuminating her features. I'm so grateful for you." He smiled softly, the feelings mutual. To Emily, their relationship was like a beautifully woven tapestry of love, trust, and shared dreams. She believed she knew every thread of John's heart, confident that their bond was unbreakable. As the months unfolded, subtle shifts began to ripple through the fabric of Emily and John's daily life. It started with small things, moments so fleeting that Emily wondered if she was imagining them. John would come home a bit later than usual, his tie slightly askew and a distant look in his eyes. One evening, Emily was preparing dinner in their cozy kitchen, the aroma of rosemary and garlic filling the air. She heard the front door open and called out cheerfully, "Hey, you're just in time. Dinner's almost ready." John stepped into the kitchen, offering a faint smile. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare," he said, loosening his tie and avoiding her gaze. She noticed the weariness etched on his face. "Long day at work?" she asked gently, reaching out to touch his arm. He nodded, pulling away slightly to grab a glass from the cupboard. "Yeah, meetings back to back. I'm exhausted." Emily sensed a barrier, like an invisible wall that hadn't been there before. "Well, I made your favorite, grilled salmon with lemon butter sauce," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "Sounds great," he replied, but his tone lacked enthusiasm. During dinner, the conversation felt stilted. John picked at his food, eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. Emily shared anecdotes about her day at the art studio, the new students in her class, the upcoming gallery exhibit. But his reactions were muted. "Are you feeling all right?" she finally asked, concern shading her voice. He glanced up, almost startled. "What? Oh yeah, I'm fine, just tired, I guess." She offered a reassuring smile. "Maybe we can plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us and Baxter, somewhere quiet." John's lips curved into a brief smile. "That sounds nice. Let's talk about it later." Later that night, Emily awoke to find John's side of the bed empty. She padded softly down the hallway and found him standing on the back porch, staring up at the stars. The cool night air whispered through the trees. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. He glanced over his shoulder. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she assured him, stepping beside him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated before replying, "Just thinking about some projects at work. Deadlines are tight." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He met her gaze for a moment before looking away. "I know, it's just boring work stuff." She nodded, though unease stirred within her. "All right, come back to bed soon, it's getting cold." "I will," he said softly. The following weeks continued much the same. John became increasingly preoccupied, his laughter less frequent, his smiles not reaching his eyes. One Saturday morning, Emily suggested they visit the farmer's market, a tradition they both loved. "Actually, I need to head into the office today," John said, sipping his coffee without meeting her eyes. "On a weekend?" she asked, surprise evident in her tone. "Can't it wait until Monday?" "Afraid not. This project is on a tight schedule." She tried to mask her disappointment. "Maybe we can have dinner together tonight then. I'll make that reservation at Luigi's." He shifted uncomfortably. "Tonight might be tough. I might be home late." "John, you've been working so hard lately, we barely see each other." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, and I'm sorry. Things will calm down soon, I promise." Emily forced a smile. "All right. Don't work too hard." As he left, Baxter trotted over to Emily, nuzzling her leg. She knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "At least I have you, huh, buddy?" She decided to visit her friend Sarah, hoping to distract herself. At the cafe, over steaming cups of chamomile tea, Sarah noticed Emily's subdued demeanor. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her eyes. Emily hesitated. "I'm not sure. John's been different lately, distant. He says it's work, but I can't shake the feeling that something else is bothering him." "Have you talked to him about it?" "I've tried, but he brushes it off. I don't want to seem pushy." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze Emily's hand. "You have every right to be concerned. Maybe give him a bit of space, but keep an eye on things." "Yeah, maybe you're right," Emily agreed, though the unease lingered. That evening, Emily sat alone on the couch, a book open in her lap but unread. The house felt unusually quiet without John's presence. Baxter rested his head on her knee, sensing her melancholy. She glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. With a sigh, she picked up her phone and sent John a quick text. Just checking in. Hope everything's okay. Minutes passed without a response. She told herself he was probably caught up in work, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. When John finally returned home, it was nearly midnight. Emily had dozed off on the couch, and the sound of the door closing stirred her awake. "Hey," she said softly, rubbing her eyes. "I waited up for you." "Sorry it's so late," he replied, shrugging off his coat. "Did everything go all right at work?" "Yeah, just took longer than expected." She stood up, approaching him cautiously. "I was worried. You didn't reply to my text." He patted his pocket. "Phone died. Didn't get a chance to charge it." An awkward silence settled between them. Emily searched his face, looking for traces of the man who once shared everything with her. "I'm glad you're home," she said finally. He offered a tired smile. "Me too. Let's get some sleep." As they settled into bed, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The distance between them felt vast, like an invisible gulf she didn't know how to cross. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his. "Good night, John," she whispered. "Good night," he replied, his hand briefly squeezing hers before releasing it. Emily closed her eyes, willing herself to believe that this was just a phase, that the warmth and openness they once shared would return. She reminded herself of the love that had woven their lives together, hoping it was strong enough to withstand whatever shadows now loomed over them. One chilly evening, as a gentle rain tapped against the windows, Emily and John settled on the couch to watch an old classic film. The soft glow from the fireplace bathed the room in a warm light, and Baxter lay curled up at their feet, snoring softly. Emily cherished these moments, hoping they signaled a return to the closeness they once shared. As the movie reached a tender scene, John's cell phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table, startling them both. He glanced at the screen, and a shadow crossed his face. "I need to take this," he muttered, grabbing the phone. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, noting the unusual urgency in his voice. "Yeah, it's just work," he replied curtly. Before she could say more, he stood up and walked briskly into the kitchen. Emily muted the television, her attention now fully on the muffled conversation emanating from the next room. She could hear the low hum of his voice but couldn't make out the words. The tone sounded tense, almost anxious. Curiosity and a hint of unease stirred within her. John rarely received work calls at home, especially not in the evening. She strained to listen, picking up fragments of his side of the conversation. "I told you not to call me here," he whispered sharply. A pause. "No, tonight isn't good." Another pause. "I'll handle it, just trust me." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The secrecy was unlike him. She glanced toward the kitchen, contemplating whether to confront him or pretend she hadn't noticed anything unusual. A few minutes later, John reappeared, his expression guarded. "Sorry about that," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Just a minor issue at work." "Must be important to call this late," she remarked, trying to keep her tone light. "Yeah, time zones and all that," he replied vaguely, sinking back onto the couch but maintaining a slight distance. Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken questions. Emily stole glances at him, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped restlessly on his knee. "Are you sure everything's all right?" she ventured again. He nodded without looking at her. "Just work stuff. Nothing to worry about." She wanted to press further but sensed he wasn't willing to share more. "If you say so," she murmured, turning her gaze back to the screen where the movie played on unnoticed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. John seemed lost in thought, and Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Was he in some kind of trouble? Was there something he wasn't telling her? Later, as they prepared for bed, the atmosphere remained strained. Emily stood at the sink, washing her face, when she heard John's phone buzz again. Peering into the bedroom, she saw him glance at the screen and quickly silence the device. "Another work call?" she asked casually, toweling off her hands. "Spam call," he replied too quickly, slipping the phone into his pocket. Her eyes met his, searching for reassurance. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He offered a tight smile. Of course. There's just not much to tell. Climbing into bed, Emily lay beside him, the distance between them palpable despite their close proximity. The familiar sound of his breathing usually soothed her, but tonight it only underscored the gulf that seemed to be widening between them. She stared at the ceiling, memories of happier times flooding her mind. Their laughter, shared secrets, the ease of their companionship. Turning her head slightly, she watched his silhouette in the dim light. "John," she whispered. He responded, eyes closed. "Are we okay?" He opened his eyes, gazing upward. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know. You've seemed distant lately, preoccupied." He sighed softly. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to make you feel that way. Work has been demanding." She reached out to touch his arm. "I'm here if you want to talk about it." He covered her hand with his own briefly. "I appreciate that. Maybe when things settle down. All right?" she said softly, withdrawing her hand. The next morning, Emily awoke to find John's side of the bed empty. A note rested on his pillow. "Had to leave early. See you tonight." She folded the note carefully, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Determined not to jump to conclusions, she tried to go about her day as usual. She spent the morning at her art studio, but found it difficult to focus. Brush in hand, she stared at the blank canvas, her thoughts elsewhere. Returning home in the afternoon, she noticed that John's briefcase was absent from its usual spot. Baxter greeted her enthusiastically, but even his wagging tail couldn't lift her spirits. She decided to distract herself by baking, a hobby she often turned to when stressed. As the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the house, her phone buzzed with a message from her friend Sarah. "Coffee tomorrow?" the text read. "Sure," Emily replied, adding a smiley face she didn't quite feel. That evening, John arrived home later than usual. "Sorry I'm late," he said, hanging up his coat. "Long day?" she asked, placing a plate of cookies on the table. "Yeah, meetings ran over," he replied, grabbing a cookie and taking a bite without enthusiasm. She watched him carefully. "I made your favorite." He forced a smile. "They're great, thanks." They sat in uncomfortable silence, the ticking of the kitchen clock unnervingly loud. Emily mustered the courage to speak. "John, is there something you're not telling me?" He looked up sharply. "What do you mean? I just feel like there's a distance between us. You're getting calls at odd hours, leaving early, coming home late. If something's wrong, I want to help." He rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "I told you, it's work. There's a lot going on right now. Is it something we can work through together?" she asked hopefully. "There's nothing to work through," he said a bit too firmly. "I just need some time to sort things out." "Sort what out?" she pressed gently. He stood up abruptly. "Can we not do this right now? I'm exhausted." She recoiled slightly at his tone. "Okay," she whispered. Without another word, he retreated upstairs. Emily remained seated, the untouched cookies a stark reminder of the widening gap between them. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake listening to the subtle sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the rustle of the trees outside, John's steady breathing beside her. Questions swirled in her mind, each one heavier than the last. As dawn approached, Emily made a decision. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Whatever was troubling John was affecting them both, and she was determined to find out the truth. The following day, while John was at work, Emily decided to tackle a long overdue task, organizing the home office. The room, which they had once shared as a creative space, had become increasingly neglected. Dust had settled on the shelves, and papers were scattered across the desk in disarray. With a sense of determination, she tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work. She started by clearing the cluttered desk, sorting through bills, old letters, and random notes. As she worked, her mind drifted to the growing tension between her and John. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in their relationship, something just out of her reach. The unease that had been gnawing at her now pushed her to seek answers in the most mundane of tasks. After an hour of tidying, Emily moved to the drawers, methodically sorting through each one. Most contained the usual items: pens, sticky notes, paper clips. But as she reached the bottom drawer, she noticed it was locked. A sense of curiosity mixed with anxiety bubbled up inside her. She couldn't recall ever seeing that drawer locked before. She hesitated for a moment, biting her lower lip. Should she even be doing this? Emily knew she was crossing a boundary, but the recent strangeness in John's behavior compelled her forward. She rifled through the drawer above, searching for a key, and after a few moments she found a small silver one tucked beneath a stack of receipts. Her heart pounded as she inserted the key into the lock and turned it with a soft click. The drawer slid open, revealing a neatly folded blanket covering something solid. Emily carefully lifted the blanket, and there, nestled beneath it, was an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn and frayed at the edges, with a small clasp holding it shut. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. She picked up the journal, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, its pages slightly yellowed with age. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Was this something from John's past? A collection of work notes? Or something more personal? She sat down on the edge of the chair, her fingers trembling as they traced the intricate design embossed on the cover. Every fiber of her being told her that this was important, that this journal held the answers she had been searching for. Yet she hesitated. Did she really want to know what secrets it contained? Once she opened it, there would be no going back. The room seemed to close in around her, the ticking of the wall clock growing louder with each passing second. Baxter, sensing her tension, padded over and nuzzled her leg, but Emily barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the journal, on the decision she was about to make. She took a deep breath, her thumb resting on the clasp. Memories of their life together flashed through her mind. John's laughter, their shared dreams, the warmth of his arms around her at night. Was this journal about to shatter the image she had of their perfect life? After what felt like an eternity, Emily made her choice. She placed the journal back in the drawer and locked it once more. She wasn't ready to confront whatever was inside, not yet. But now, the knowledge of its existence lingered in the back of her mind, a silent specter that would not be ignored. Rising from the chair, she returned the key to its hiding place and left the office, closing the door behind her. As she walked down the hallway, she knew that this small act of restraint wouldn't last long. The journal, with all its potential revelations, would call to her again soon. A few days later, unable to resist the growing curiosity and anxiety gnawing at her, Emily found herself back in the office, the locked drawer now an unavoidable temptation. This time, she didn't hesitate. She retrieved the key, unlocked the drawer, and pulled out the leather-bound journal. The room was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and Baxter's gentle breathing as he slept by the door. Emily sat down at the desk, the journal heavy in her hands. With a deep breath, she unclasped the cover and opened it to the first page. The writing was unmistakably John's, neat, precise, each letter carefully formed. She began to read, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, at first unsure of what she was looking for. The first few pages were innocuous enough, filled with notes about work, ideas for projects, and a few entries about their life together. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Entries appeared that mentioned people and places Emily had never heard of before, names she didn't recognize, cities John had never mentioned visiting. Her pulse quickened as she continued reading. One entry described a business trip to Seattle that John had supposedly taken last year. Emily remembered that week clearly. John had said he was attending a conference in Boston, but here it was, in black and white, detailed notes about meetings with someone named Marlene in Seattle. Emily's heart raced as she turned to the next page. The entries became more troubling. John had written about dinners, late-night conversations, and shared moments with people Emily had never known existed. One passage mentioned a woman named Claire, someone who had apparently become quite close to John. There were descriptions of private dinners in small, out-of-the-way restaurants, conversations that lingered late into the night, and even a weekend getaway to a cabin by a lake. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There had never been any mention of Claire in their life, nor of any such trips. Her fingers trembled as she turned to the middle of the journal. There, tucked between the pages, were several photographs. They were candid shots, the kind taken without the subject's knowledge. John standing next to a woman, her face partially obscured by her hair, the two of them laughing together. Another photo showed them walking side by side, down a street Emily didn't recognize, their shoulders brushing as if in comfortable familiarity. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The reality she had known, the life she had built with John, began to crack like fragile glass. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the photos, her mind reeling with the implications. The man she thought she knew, the husband she had trusted implicitly, had a life she had never been a part of. As she continued to flip through the journal, she found more entries detailing these secretive meetings, more references to people and places that were completely foreign to her. The notes were meticulous, almost clinical, as if John had compartmentalized this other existence from the life he shared with Emily. The last few entries were the most unsettling. They hinted at plans for the future, for meetings that were yet to happen, and for decisions that seemed to exclude Emily entirely. The words blurred in front of her eyes as she struggled to make sense of it all. Sitting there in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's deception, Emily felt her world unraveling. The man she had loved and lived with for years had been hiding something monumental from her, something that changed everything. The weight of the revelations pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. She couldn't bring herself to read any further, not now. She closed the journal, her mind spinning with questions she wasn't yet ready to confront. For a moment, she just sat there, staring blankly at the closed book in front of her, the photographs still vivid in her mind. The reality she had believed in, the trust she had placed in John was shattered, leaving her in a state of stunned disbelief. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and pain. But amid the chaos, one thing became clear. She needed answers. She couldn't let the unsettling discoveries in John's journal fester in the shadows. With a determination born of desperation, she began to meticulously piece together the fragments of John's hidden life. For days, Emily immersed herself in the task, her art studio abandoned as she focused on unraveling the mystery. She pored over the names and locations mentioned in the journal, cross-referencing them with online records, social media, and even old maps. The more she dug, the more she realized just how deep this hidden world of John's went. Places he had never spoken of, names that seemed to mean nothing on the surface, began to take on a darker significance as she connected the dots. One name stood out among the others, a small town called Brookfield, nestled in the countryside about an hour's drive from their home. John had mentioned it several times in the journal, often in the context of secretive meetings and unexplained trips. Emily had never heard him talk about Brookfield before, and it wasn't a place they had ever visited together. What could possibly tie John to this obscure, out-of-the-way town? Driven by a need for clarity, Emily decided to go there herself. She left the house early one morning, the journal tucked into her bag, and set out on the winding road to Brookfield. The drive was long and solitary, with only the steady hum of the engine and her own racing thoughts for company. As she approached the town, the landscape grew more rural, rolling fields, clusters of trees, and a few scattered farmhouses. It was the kind of place where everyone likely knew each other, a stark contrast to the life she and John had built in the city. The town itself was small, almost quaint. A single main street ran through its center, lined with old brick buildings that looked like they had stood for a century or more. There was a general store, a cafe, and a small post office, all bearing the worn charm of a bygone era. Emily parked her car near the cafe and took a deep breath before stepping out. She walked down the quiet street, the morning air cool against her skin. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation as she began her search. Her first stop was the cafe, where she hoped to find someone who might recognize the names from the journal. Inside, the place was warm and smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. A few locals sat at the tables, chatting quietly over their breakfasts. Emily approached the counter, where an elderly woman stood, wiping down the surface. "Good morning," Emily began, her voice slightly shaky. "I'm looking for some information about this town. I was wondering if you might know some of the people who live around here. Not much happens here without everyone knowing about it. Well, some of these folks have been around here for years. Old families, you know. But why are you asking? I think there's something he's been keeping from me. It's been abandoned for years, but it used to belong to one of the families on your list. It's a bit of a walk from here, but you can't miss it. Big old place sits on a hill overlooking the town." She followed the woman's directions, walking through the town and up a narrow path that led to the outskirts. The house came into view as she rounded a bend in the path, and Emily stopped in her tracks, a chill running down her spine. The building was grand but clearly neglected, its windows dark and empty. the once white paint peeling away in long strips. It stood in stark contrast to the surrounding landscape, its presence almost ghostly against the clear blue sky. Emily approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The closer she got, the more she felt the weight of the past pressing in around her. This place held secrets, she could feel it, and those secrets were somehow tied to John. She reached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. The air was still, almost oppressive, as she pushed the door open and stepped into the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air smelled of decay and neglect, the faint scent of something long forgotten. Emily walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, but there were signs that someone had been here more recently. Footprints in the dust, a chair that looked as if it had been moved. Her heart pounded in her chest as she explored the rooms, each one revealing more of the house's former grandeur and current desolation. Finally, she reached a room at the back of the house, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside and stopped dead in her tracks. The room was filled with old photographs, letters, and papers, all carefully arranged on a large table in the center. As she walked closer, she saw that the photos were of John, at different ages, in different places, many of which she didn't recognize. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Emily drove home in a daze, her mind racing as she replayed the discoveries she had made in Brookfield. The images from the abandoned house, the faces in the photographs, the connection to John, it all swirled together in a storm of emotions she could barely contain. By the time she pulled into the driveway, her hands were trembling, and her heart pounded with a mixture of anger and dread. As she stepped into the house, the familiar surroundings felt strangely foreign, as if the life she had known was now a thin veneer over a deeper, darker reality. She could hear the soft ticking of the clock in the living room and the distant hum of the refrigerator. But the house felt empty, almost hollow. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows through the windows, adding an eerie stillness to the atmosphere. John was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water when she walked in. He looked up, surprised to see her home earlier than usual. "Hey, you're back," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How was your day?" She couldn't bring herself to exchange pleasantries, not with the weight of what she had uncovered pressing down on her. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the journal and the photos she had found, placing them on the kitchen table with deliberate precision. John's smile faltered as he looked at the items on the table. His eyes flicked to Emily's, searching for some sign of what she was thinking, but her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm that hid the turmoil beneath. "John," she began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "I went to Brookfield today." "Brookfield?" he echoed, though it was clear he knew exactly what she meant. "Yes," Emily continued, her gaze never leaving his. "I found the house, I found the photographs, and I found this." She tapped the journal with her finger, the sound sharp in the silence between them. John didn't move, didn't speak. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with tension. Emily felt a wave of emotions crash over her, anger, betrayal, hurt, but she kept them in check, determined to see this through. "I want to know the truth, John," she said quietly. "No more lies, no more secrets. I want to know everything." Emily took a step closer, her voice softening but losing none of its resolve. "I deserve to know, John. After everything we've been through, I deserve that much." The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and the weight of the truth that hung in the balance. Emily could see the conflict in John's eyes, the struggle between keeping his secrets and finally letting them go. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath held in anticipation. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever the truth was, she needed to hear it from him, needed to understand the man she had married, the man who had been living a life she had never known. Finally, John let out a long, shaky breath and lowered his head, as if the fight had gone out of him. The silence stretched on, and Emily felt the tension in the room shift, as if something was about to give way. John stood motionless in the kitchen, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had settled upon them. The silence between him and Emily was thick with tension, the air charged with the anticipation of what was to come. Finally, he took a deep, unsteady breath, as though gathering the strength to face what he had long avoided. "I've been hiding something from you," John began, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet Emily's eyes. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Every muscle in her body was tense, bracing for whatever revelation was about to come. John swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find the words. "Before I met you," he said slowly, "there was someone else. Her name was Claire. We were together for a couple of years," John continued, his voice trembling slightly. "It was serious, or at least I thought it was. But things didn't work out. We went our separate ways, or so I thought. A few months after we broke up, I found out that she was pregnant. She never told me until after the baby was born," John continued, his voice thick with emotion. "A boy. His name is Michael. I didn't know how to handle it. I was young, scared, and I didn't want to believe it was true, but I had a responsibility, and I tried to be there as much as I could." The betrayal cut deep, yet she couldn't ignore the pain in John's voice, the regret that laced every word. "I didn't know how to tell you," John said, finally looking up to meet her gaze. His eyes were filled with guilt and sorrow. "When we met, I wanted a fresh start. I wanted to leave all of that behind and start a new life with you. But as time went on, it became harder and harder to tell you. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd leave me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Yet beneath it all, there was also a flicker of compassion, a small voice that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with, who was now standing before her, broken and vulnerable." John's voice cracked as he continued. "I know I should have told you. I should have been honest from the beginning, but every time I tried, the fear just paralyzed me. And the longer I kept it from you, the more impossible it seemed to ever come clean. But at the same time, she could see the torment in John's expression, the way he seemed to crumble under the weight of his own guilt. The truth was out now, laid bare between them, and there was no going back. John had a son, a child she had never known about, a secret he had carried alone for years. The reality of it all left her feeling hollow, as though the ground beneath her had shifted and she was struggling to find her footing. The room was silent except for the faint sound of Baxter's paws padding softly on the floor, the dog sensing the tension, but unsure of how to respond. Emily looked at John, seeing him for who he truly was, flawed, scared, but also deeply remorseful. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking into the abyss of what their life could become after this revelation. The choice of what to do next loomed large, but for now, she remained rooted in place, the full impact of John's confession settling over her like a heavy cloak. Emily sat in the quiet of the living room after John's confession, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a heavy fog. The room, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Her mind swirled with emotions, anger, sorrow, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal that gnawed at her heart. She stared out the window, watching the evening light fade into dusk, her thoughts racing. How could John have kept something so monumental from her? A son, his child, their child. The realization left her reeling, and she struggled to reconcile the man she had loved for years with the secrets he had harbored. Emily's love for John had been the foundation of their life together. Every memory they had built, every moment of joy, every quiet evening spent in each other's company, all seemed tainted now by the lies that had lain beneath the surface. She thought about the man who had held her through life's trials, who had made her laugh when she felt like crying, who had shared in her dreams and supported her through everything. Was this the same man who had hidden such a significant part of his life from her? As the shadows deepened outside, Emily felt a profound sense of loss, as if the future she had envisioned was slipping through her fingers like sand. She tried to imagine what their life would be like now, with the knowledge of John's other life hanging between them. Could she ever trust him again? Would she ever look at him without remembering the betrayal that had shattered her world? But as she thought of John, she also remembered his pain, how broken he had seemed when he finally confessed. She had seen the torment in his eyes, the deep regret etched into his face. He had been afraid, paralyzed by the fear of losing her, and while she couldn't excuse his deception, she couldn't ignore the humanity in his actions either. John wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made mistakes, who had let fear guide his choices, who now stood before her, vulnerable and pleading for her understanding. Emily felt a tear slide down her cheek, followed by another, until she was quietly sobbing, her emotions too powerful to contain. She thought about the boy, Michael, a child who was innocent in all of this, a child who had been kept hidden from her, but who was undeniably a part of John's life. What did it mean for them now, knowing that John had another family out there, a connection that could never be erased? The room around her blurred as she cried, the images of her life with John flashing before her eyes, their wedding day, the vacations they had taken, the nights spent talking until dawn. She had always believed their love could withstand anything, but now that belief felt fragile, like a glass figurine on the edge of a shelf, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Emily's thoughts turned to forgiveness. Could she forgive John for the years of lies, for keeping such a vital part of his life hidden from her? And even if she could find it in her heart to forgive, what would that mean for their future together? Could they rebuild the trust that had been broken, or would this secret forever cast a shadow over their marriage? She stood up, wiping her tears, and walked over to the mantel where photos of their life together were displayed. She picked up a picture from their honeymoon, the two of them smiling on a beach, the sun setting behind them. It had been a moment of pure happiness, a time when the future seemed bright and full of promise. Now, as she looked at the photo, she felt a deep sadness, mourning the innocence of those days. Emily placed the photo back on the mantel and sank onto the couch, her mind still racing. She knew she had to make a decision, but the path ahead was murky, filled with uncertainty and fear. The love she felt for John was still there, but it was now tangled with hurt and mistrust. She wanted to believe that they could overcome this, that their love could endure, but the doubts were overwhelming, like a storm raging inside her. For now, all she could do was sit in the silence, the weight of the dilemma pressing down on her as she tried to find a way forward. Emily knew that to fully grasp the situation she found herself in, she needed to meet Lisa, the mother of John's son, Michael. It was a step she dreaded, but also felt was necessary to understand the truth from every angle. With determination and a sense of urgency, she reached out to Lisa, who was understandably reluctant at first. However, after some gentle persuasion, Lisa agreed to meet. They arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between their towns, a neutral ground that felt safe for such an emotionally charged conversation. The cafe was quiet, with just a few patrons scattered around, the low murmur of conversations blending with the soft clinking of cups and saucers. Emily arrived first, her nerves tightly wound, and chose a table in a secluded corner where they could talk privately. When Lisa walked in, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She immediately recognized the woman from the photos she had found in the journal, tall, with striking features and a calm, composed demeanor, but there was a wariness in Lisa's eyes, a caution that spoke volumes about the tension between them. As Lisa approached the table, Emily stood up, offering a tentative smile that Lisa returned with equal hesitation. "Lisa?" Emily asked softly, extending her hand. Lisa nodded, shaking her hand briefly before sitting down. "Emily, thank you for meeting with me," she said, her voice measured and careful. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Emily replied, trying to keep her own voice steady despite the turmoil roiling inside her. There was a moment of awkward silence as they both settled in, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Emily could feel her heart pounding, but she forced herself to stay calm, to remember why she was here. "I think we both have a lot of questions," Emily began, her eyes meeting Lisa's. "And I think it's important that we're both honest with each other. I just want to understand what's been happening, and maybe we can help each other." "When did you first meet John?" she asked, keeping her tone gentle. Lisa's gaze shifted to the window for a moment, as if she was recalling a distant memory. "We met about 10 years ago," she said quietly. "It was a complicated time in both our lives. We were both trying to figure things out, and we ended up finding comfort in each other." She felt a pang of sadness at the thought of the man she loved being so deeply entwined in someone else's life, but she pushed it aside for now. "I didn't know about you," Lisa continued, her voice tinged with regret. "Not until much later. John, he never mentioned you, at least not in a way that made me think you were serious. When I found out I was pregnant, he was already distancing himself." I thought it was just another relationship that would fade away, but then Michael was born. She felt a pang of empathy for Lisa, realizing that they were both victims of John's fears and indecision. "He visited sometimes," Lisa said, her eyes flicking back to Emily's. "But it was never consistent. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he would look at Michael and then pull away. I think he wanted to be there for us, but he was too afraid of what it would mean for him, for his life, for you." "I believe you, and I'm sorry you had to find out this way. It's not fair to you or to Michael." Emily felt a mixture of emotions: anger at John for putting them all in this situation, sadness for the pain Lisa had endured, and a deep sense of uncertainty about what this meant for her own future. "I've spent so many years wondering why," Lisa said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Why he couldn't just be honest, why he couldn't be there for his son. But I think it all comes down to fear. He was afraid of losing you, and in that fear, he hurt both of us." John's actions, while deeply flawed, were rooted in a fear of loss that had driven him to make choices that were easier in the moment, but devastating in the long run. "He's not a bad person," Lisa added, her tone softer. "But he's a scared one, and that fear has caused so much pain, for all of us." They were two women who had loved the same man, who had been hurt by the same lies, and who now faced the daunting task of figuring out where to go from here. As the conversation continued, Emily felt a sense of clarity beginning to form. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time since discovering John's secret, she didn't feel completely alone. There was still a long way to go, but at least now, she wasn't the only one carrying the burden of the truth. After her emotional meeting with Lisa, Emily spent days in deep reflection. The weight of everything she had learned, combined with the years of deception, pressed down on her heavily. She found herself wandering through their home, the memories of her life with John playing in her mind like a silent film. Every room, every photograph, every shared moment seemed to hold a question she wasn't sure she could answer. She thought about the love they had shared, the trust that had been shattered, and the future that now lay before them, uncertain and full of doubt. Emily knew that the decision she was about to make would not only affect her and John, but also Lisa, and most importantly, Michael. The innocence of the child weighed heavily on her heart. He was caught in the middle of this tangled mess, through no fault of his own. Emily spent long hours alone, sometimes sitting in the garden where she had once felt so much peace, trying to find clarity. Baxter, sensing her distress, would lay his head on her lap, offering silent comfort as she wrestled with her thoughts. She went through every possible scenario in her mind. What would happen if she stayed, if she left, if she tried to rebuild, or if she walked away? Conversations with Lisa had given her new insights, helping her see beyond her own pain and consider the broader picture. Lisa had been understanding, even supportive, encouraging Emily to make the decision that felt right for her, without judgment. Their discussions had been eye-opening, revealing the depth of John's fear and the consequences it had wrought on all their lives. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the house, Emily made her choice. The decision crystallized in her mind, clear and unshakable. She knew it would surprise everyone, John, Lisa, and even herself. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the one that felt right, the one that aligned with her values and the kind of person she wanted to be. Emily understood that this decision would set their lives on a new path, one that none of them had anticipated. It was a choice born out of pain, reflection, and ultimately a desire to find a way forward that honored the truth and the people she cared about. She felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, resolve, and a small glimmer of hope, knowing that this decision, once made, would shape their future in ways she couldn't fully predict. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Emily stood by the window, watching the last light fade. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a cloak. It was time. Emily knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The betrayal she felt was deep, and the wounds John's secrets had left would take time to heal. But as she reflected on everything, on her love for John, on the innocent child caught in the middle, and on her own part in their life together, she realized that the only way forward was through forgiveness. It wasn't just about forgiving John. That was certainly part of it, but it was also about forgiving herself. For years she had trusted him implicitly, believed in their love without question, and never suspected that there might be something hidden beneath the surface. She had to forgive herself for not seeing the signs, for not questioning the small inconsistencies, and for allowing herself to be blindsided by the truth. With this understanding, Emily made a decision that was both bold and transformative. She would rebuild her relationship with John, but only if it was built on a foundation of complete honesty. This time, there could be no more secrets, no more lies. They would need to confront everything head-on, including the existence of Michael, and find a way to make him a part of their lives. The night she shared her decision with John was filled with emotion. She found him sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television, which was muted, as if the noise would have been too much to bear. He looked up when she entered, his eyes filled with the guilt and sorrow he had been carrying for so long. "John," she began softly, sitting down beside him, "we need to talk." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she continued, "about everything, about us, about what you've done, and about what we need to do moving forward. I know I've hurt you in ways that I can never fully make up for." "What are you saying?" "I want that too. I want to be honest with you about everything. I just didn't know how to before." He had never imagined that Emily would be willing to include Michael in their lives after everything that had happened. "You mean, you're okay with that?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "I'm not saying it will be easy," Emily admitted, "but I'm willing to try. Michael deserves to know his father, and he deserves to know that he's not a secret, not something to be hidden away." He had expected anger, maybe even hatred, but instead she was offering him a chance to make things right, to build something new from the ruins of their old life. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve this, but I promise you I'll do everything I can to make this work." Together, they met with Lisa, discussing how best to bring Michael into their lives in a way that would be healthy and supportive for him. It was awkward at first, but gradually they began to find a rhythm, a new normal that included Michael as an integral part of their family. As they worked through their issues, Emily found that her anger and pain began to lessen. It wasn't that she had forgotten what John had done, but she began to understand it in a new light. She saw the fear and insecurity that had driven his actions, and while she couldn't excuse them, she could forgive them. And in forgiving John, she found a measure of peace for herself as well. Their relationship was far from perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and hurt, but they were both committed to making it work. Slowly, they began to rediscover the love that had once been the foundation of their marriage. Only this time, it was deeper, stronger, and more resilient because it had been tested and had survived. In the end, Emily's decision to forgive and rebuild transformed their story from one of betrayal and loss into one of redemption and renewed love. It wasn't the future she had imagined when they first married, but it was one that held the promise of something new, something real, and something worth fighting for.